Among the most beloved winter fairy tales in the world is Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen, a story of friendship, loss, and a love brave enough to cross the frozen ends of the earth. Before we go on, if you enjoy stories like this from around the world, please like and subscribe for new stories daily. In a crowded northern town, where the rooftops leaned close and snow gathered in the gutters, there lived two poor children named Gerda and Kai. They were not brother and sister, yet they loved each other as dearly as if they had shared the same home and the same cradle. Outside their little windows, their families kept wooden flower boxes with roses and herbs in the warmer months. In winter, when frost sealed the panes, the children warmed coins on the stove and pressed them against the glass to make tiny, clear holes so they could smile at one another through the ice. Those were happy days, full of stories, roses, and simple joy. But before we can understand the danger that came to Kai, we must speak of a wicked mirror made long ago by a cruel spirit. In that mirror, everything good and beautiful looked small, crooked, and foolish, while everything harsh, ugly, and broken seemed larger than life. One day the mirror shattered into countless glittering fragments and scattered across the world on the wind. Some splinters flew into people's eyes, so that they saw only faults. Some flew into hearts, and wherever they landed, warmth turned cold. One bright day, while Gerda and Kai sat together among the roses, laughing over a picture book, Kai suddenly cried out. A tiny shard had flown into his eye and another into his heart. At once he changed. The roses looked dull to him. Gerda's tears annoyed him. The old song sounded childish. He mocked what he had once loved, and each day he grew sharper, colder, and stranger, as though winter had crept inside him long before the snow came. Then winter came in earnest. Snow piled in the streets, bells jingled from passing sleighs, and children raced across the square on little sledges. Kai, who no longer feared the cold, tied his sled to larger sleighs for sport, and laughed as he was pulled faster and farther through the falling snow. One day a magnificent white sleigh glided through the storm. In it sat a woman all in white, beautiful and terrible, her robes made of drifting snow, her eyes bright as winter stars. It was the Snow Queen. She beckoned to Kai, and because the shard in his heart had made him hunger for cold perfection, he followed. She wrapped him in a fur of white, kissed his brow until he forgot home, Gerda, and even his own tears, and carried him away into the high frozen north. When Kai did not return, Gerda searched the streets in fear. No one could tell her where he had gone, but in her heart she knew he was not dead. Somewhere beyond the snow and silence he was waiting. When the spring rivers began to move again, Gerda could bear the waiting no longer. She put on her red shoes and set out alone to search for Kai. She asked the river whether it had carried him away, and in her innocence, she even offered the water her bright little shoes if it would give him back. The river only carried her farther downstream in a drifting boat, through soft green banks and trembling reeds, until she came to a little cottage wrapped in flowers. An old woman lived there, gentle-voiced and smiling, with a crooked staff and a garden full of impossible summer bloom. She welcomed Gerda kindly, brushed her hair, and wished to keep her always. By quiet magic she made Gerda forget Kai for a little while. Yet the roses in the old woman's hat reminded Gerda of the roses by her own window, and memory came rushing back like tears after a long delay. Then Gerda knew she must leave at once. She thanked the old woman, stepped back into the world, and hurried onward before forgetfulness could trap her again. Gerda walked on through the changing seasons, and at last met a wise crow who listened to her story with grave attention. The crow told her that a clever young girl had recently married a prince, and that before the wedding a strange boy had been brought to the palace, so bold and bright that many thought him special. Gerda's heart leapt. Perhaps it was Kai. The crow led her through moonlit halls to a warm chamber where a prince and princess slept beneath embroidered curtains. But when Gerda leaned close, the sleeping boy was not Kai. Still, the prince and princess pitied her brave search. They clothed her warmly, gave her food, and sent her onward in a little golden carriage lined with fur. For a moment Gerda rested in kindness, yet she did not mistake comfort for her destination. She had not crossed rivers and forgotten gardens merely to stop halfway. So with thanks in her heart, and Kai's name still guiding her, she continued northward into wilder country than she had ever known. But the road ahead was not gentle. In a dark forest, the golden carriage was attacked by robbers, fierce and ragged beneath the pine trees. Gerda was seized and carried to their camp, where a wild robber girl claimed her as a plaything. The robber girl was rough, sharp and fearless, but she was not without a heart. When Gerda spoke of Kai and how far she had come for love alone, the robber girl grew quiet. She gave Gerda food, let her sleep beside a warm reindeer, and listened while the woodland creatures whispered of the Snow Queen's far northern realm. Before dawn, the robber girl set Gerda free. She placed her on the reindeer's back, wrapped her in fur, and sent her racing toward Lapland through the stinging snow. It was a strange kindness, fierce and sudden as a spark in darkness. Gerda carried it with her as she rode into the white silence, knowing that help sometimes comes from the least expected hands. At last Gerda reached the far north, where the world seemed stripped down to snow, stone, sky, and breath. In Lapland and Finland she found wise women who understood winter better than kings did. They told her they could not make her stronger than she already was, for her strength was the strength of innocence, loyalty, and love. So Gerda went on alone to the Snow Queen's palace, a vast frozen hall made of glittering drifts, sharp blue ice, and silence older than memory. There, in the very heart of the palace, sat Kai. He was pale and still, arranging shining pieces of ice in careful patterns, trying to form a word the Snow Queen had commanded him to spell. If he could complete it, she had promised him power and freedom. But the shard in his heart kept him cold, and the shard in his eye made the whole world look hard and lifeless. He did not know that Gerda was already near him, crossing the terrible cold for his sake. Gerda entered the palace through a storm of razor-cold snow. The air stung her face, and the halls seemed so cold they might freeze thought itself. Yet she kept moving, whispering prayers and remembering summer roses, warm windows, and the friend she had come to save. When she found Kai at last, he did not greet her. He hardly looked up. The shard in his eye had turned love into inconvenience, and the shard in his heart had turned sorrow into ice. Gerda ran to him and threw her arms around him anyway. She wept, not in despair, but with the deep grief of all she had endured to reach him. Her tears fell on his chest and warmed the frozen splinter in his heart until it melted. Then Kai began to cry too, and those tears washed the glass from his eye. Suddenly he knew her. He saw Gerda as she truly was, and with that clear sight the palace no longer seemed eternal. It was only cold, and cold can be endured. Love had broken the spell where force never could. The icy puzzle pieces around Kai seemed suddenly less important than dust. He and Gerda laughed and cried together, and the frozen word he had been striving to form no longer held any power over him. Outside, the Snow Queen was gone on one of her long flights through the winter sky, and the palace itself had lost its hold. The reindeer waited. The northern women had already sent quiet blessings after them. So the two children began the long journey home, no longer chasing or searching, but returning. The wilderness that had seemed so terrible now opened before them like a road. Friends helped them as they passed back through snowfields, forests, and towns. Every kindness they had been given seemed to meet them again, as if the world had been quietly keeping account of Gerda's faithful heart all along. Though they were still children, something in them had deepened. They had gone through sorrow and cold, and come out holding tighter to what truly mattered. At last, Gerda and Kai came back to their old town. The streets were familiar, yet they no longer seemed small. The windows, the roofs, the little stairways, even the flower boxes between the attics, all appeared touched by a quiet holiness, because the children had learned what it meant to lose one another and be found again. They climbed the stairs and stood once more at the little windows where they had smiled through circles melted in the frost. Outside, the roses bloomed again. They were no longer exactly the same children who had once played there, for sorrow had passed over them like winter over a garden. But neither were they hardened. They had kept the best part of childhood, and that made all the difference. Gerda's courage had not become pride. Kai's suffering had not become bitterness. Together they sat beneath the roses in the warm light and felt that love, once tested, can come back stronger, quieter, and truer than before. Their grandmother read from the old stories as she had done long before, and this time Kai understood them differently. Beauty was no longer something cold and flawless, like snow cut into sharp patterns. True beauty was warm enough to suffer, faithful enough to search, and humble enough to forgive. The world still held winter, of course. There would always be storms, losses, and hours when the heart feels terribly alone. Yet Gerda and Kai had learned that no frost lasts forever, where love keeps watch. The Snow Queen herself remained somewhere in the wide white north, beautiful and remote as ever, but her power had limits. She could command blizzards and silence, yet she could not command a loving heart to give up. That was the victory hidden inside Gerda's long journey. Not the defeating of a queen by force, but the proving that innocence, courage, and steadfast affection can cross any frozen distance and return home carrying spring. And so the story of the Snow Queen reminds us that the coldest dangers are not always storms or ice, but the hardening of the heart, the habit of seeing only faults, and the temptation to stop loving when love becomes difficult. Gerda did not rescue Kai with power, cleverness, or magic greater than the Queen's. She saved him by remaining true, by remembering who he really was when he himself had forgotten, and by refusing to let fear or distance make her give up. That is why this winter tale has lasted so long. Beneath the snow and crystal and northern lights, it tells a deeply human truth. A loving heart is stronger than enchantment. A faithful friend can walk farther than pride can imagine. And after even the longest winter, roses can bloom again. So let the snow fall softly now, and carry with you the thought that whatever in life has turned cold may yet be warmed, if met with courage, patience, and love.